So I first met Sholem soon after his new memoir about leaving the Hasidic world, All Who Go Do Not Return, was published when I interviewed him for the Jewish Week. As Sholem writes, and he'll tell us a lot more later, he was in his 20s, married and the father of 5, when he was expelled from his community of New Square. But he already knew that he couldn't stay. I was struck by his brutal honesty in his book and in person, and also by his lyrical, really beautiful writing. We called him the poet laureate of ex-Hasidim. But Shulem's book really adds singular depth and insight to the growing genre of books and movies about leaving the Hasidic world. And I've known Basya for some years. I love her music, and I've come also to know her backstory. And she grew up in a yeshivish world, and she left, exploring the worlds of music and dance far beyond Brooklyn. She eventually went to Barnard and on to a flourishing career as a singer, composer, musician, and leader of the band Pharaoh's Daughter.
I'm going to do a bit of reading from my book. It is in chapter 15, parts of chapter 15. I won't read the whole thing. Among people who lose faith, I would learn, many point to scientific knowledge as the catalyst for the changed worldviews. I, too, found much of what I learned troubling. Wherever I turned, I discovered that ideas I had once taken for granted, trusting in rabbis and sacred texts to convey absolute truths, were dubious at best. The universe, I learned, was not 6,000 years old, but closer to 14 billion. Humans shared a common ancestor with apes, and all living things, for that matter, and were not the exalted species created by God's hand out of clay of the earth on the 6th day of creation. The sages of the Talmud, by our traditions infallible, were demonstrably wrong in their understanding of the natural world. 2 great balls of fire descended from heaven, and their names were Abaya and Rava, said the old Rebbe of Ruzhin. The 2 great masters of the Talmud, their names occurring at least once every 3 pages, were not humans, but chunks of divinity, balls of fire, said the Rebbe of Ruzhin. Reading the Talmud anew, however, I discovered that the sages were as flawed as could be expected of any ancient people. They were mired in superstition and misogyny and xenophobia, which didn't necessarily mark them as villains, but offered troubling indications of ordinary humanness. Nothing, however, had a more shattering impact on my faith than the realization that, stripped of religious exegesis, our primary religious text, the Hebrew Bible, had the markings of human rather than divine authorship. It was beautiful, intricate, layered in poetry and metaphor and heart-stopping drama, but human nonetheless. According to the Zohar, the 11th century work that forms the basic text for the Judaic mystical tradition, God gazed upon the Torah and created the universe. The Torah, divine and eternal, was the blueprint for all existence. Now, however, I could no longer see it that way. The very essence of our faith, passed down, it was believed, from generation to generation over 3,300 years without change, was most likely a collection of ancient documents authored and compiled and redacted over many centuries. This was the view of all modern Bible scholars. I didn't have to take their word for it, but the evidence for their view was compelling. Suddenly, all the strangeness of this text, the contradictions and anachronisms and troubling tales of fratricide and genocide, and great family dramas and tales of wondrous miracles, all of it now made sense, but in an entirely new way. Seen through the prism of history and anthropology, buttressed by studies in archaeology, and laid side by side with other texts from the ancient peoples of the Near East, the Bible was an endlessly fascinating window into the world of our ancestors, but as a basis for theology, to me, it simply fell short. I remember the haze of months, then years passing, as I desperately wished for my faith to return. Even as I realized that like a broken porcelain dish, the pieces might be glued back together, and the dish might hold for a while, but soon enough it would break again along that very same crack. Losing your faith is not like realizing you got an arithmetic problem wrong. It is more like discovering your entire mathematical system is flawed, that every calculation you've ever made was incorrect. Your bank balance is off. Your life savings might be gone. Your business could be in the red when you've imagined it to be flourishing. Except you seem to be the only one who realizes it. And how is that possible? Is everyone crazy? Could you really be the only sane one? And if the entire world goes by a flawed system, doesn't it, in some odd way, make the wrong way right? Or at least there's consistency. Everyone else is in sync, zigzagging together, while you walk the straight line alone. And yet you know that you are right and they are wrong. You can demonstrate it if given the chance, but they won't give you the chance. You can't speak of it because if you do, you'll be like the lunatic who prophesies end of times, doom and gloom, or like the one heralding some new age brand of salvation and redemption. Passerby can barely be bothered to snigger. The inner turmoil left me dizzy with grief over my lost faith. I wanted it back. I wanted the feelings of ecstasy I'd had from reciting Nishmat Kol Chai or singing Yedid Nefesh. I wanted to feel the words of Torah as, in the words of the Talmud, black fire on white. I wanted to study the Hasidic texts I had once found so much joy in, experience again the euphoria of singing God, the master of all creation, with thousands of other Hasidim on Shabbat morning, and feel the near tangible presence of the sublime. But it was all gone. The comforts of prayer, too, were no longer available. For some years, I tried to hold on to them, even as I wasn't sure there was value to it, clinging particularly to the meditative experience of reciting Psalms. Yet as the years passed, I began to see in those words only the mounting frustration of attempting to retrieve something I had lost, even while knowing it was futile. Chesky had tempted me with the rational, and I had succumbed to its allure. The universe, as if in response, said, "You want rational? Well, here's rational." And it removed from me all those irrational but vital comforts. Worst of all was the realization that I had to build myself a new value system. When everything you've ever known is suddenly up for question, what do you retain and what do you discard? What is the meaning of right and wrong when there is no guidance from a divine being? And most of all, if we're all but an accident of matter and energy, with no greater purpose beyond our immediate natural needs, what then is the point of it all? Thank you.
I had a surprisingly coherent epiphany in 9th grade organic chemistry. Now, this is more surprising than it may seem at first. I grew up in Borough Park, which in the 70s and 80s was becoming one of the world's largest Haredi enclaves. I remember the Young Israel slowly losing its members to the burgeoning modern Orthodox Flatbush, while the Reform Temple on 13th Avenue, well known for its famous classical chazanim, began losing members completely. Whoever was already religious started becoming more observant to keep up with the growing fervor around them. The Satmar, Babiv, Munkach, Pupa Hasidic enclaves were like magnetic loci of insular, restrained, deep, ecstatic devotion. Waves of black strimals spilled out into the streets in Borough Park, later than the Svardische Schul and Machzike or the little Stieblich. It was some kind of status test. Who could finish davening later? Who can count more children, or not count children? Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 8, not 10. It keeps going. It was during this time that Borough Park began to epitomize the gross paradoxes inherent in living in our little shtetl, in the biggest bustling city in the world. I lived on a block that dead-ended into a bluff overlooking train tracks. A few times a day, a slow-moving, rickety freight train would come from somewhere and go someplace else. I spent hours on top of a dirt hill imagining myself running down and jumping aboard an open car while it's made its slow progress under McDonald Avenue and having some unimaginable adventure that would take me far away from my home. I could at that time only conceive of places like Flatbush, Coney Island, Catskills, Manhattan, Israel, and somehow China. But even there, adventures were possible. And in high school, I went to an all-girls yeshiva where secular studies weren't as important as Jewish studies, which makes my chemistry epiphany even more surprising. Nevertheless, one day, I was introduced to the periodic table. The teacher explained how the atom is comprised of a nucleus with protons and neutrons, which give the atom its charge, and that around the nucleus were different orbitals where the electrons would revolve. Electrons that were closest to the nucleus kept the nature of the atom intact, and those electrons that were further away would absorb energy or light, become excitable, and start jumping to progressively outer orbitals. These electrons on the outermost orbitals would then be available to attract highly energized electrons from other atoms to create compounds. The teacher used this word, fluid mosaic, to describe the process. I suddenly and very clearly understood myself and the world I grew up in as very distinct parts of that magnificent fluid mosaic, each one of us necessary but also crucially different. It's likely that I misunderstood what the teacher said, or that the teacher himself misunderstood the material. But this misunderstanding enabled me to understand something about my place in the world that I had not known. I was already parable-oriented. So many things I learned were a mushal or an allegory to teach a higher moral lesson. And to me, this chemistry lesson was a mushal for who I was in relationship to the world that I was coming from. I understood that those fervent believers, or Hasidim, who hold closely to the traditions they were born into, these are the electrons closest to the nucleus. But my curiosity and nature meant that I absorbed other energy, which made me an excitable electron, one that leapt orbitals and was more likely to be on the outer edge, springing into fusions, combinations, collaborations, rather than staying close to home. But in addition to giving me insight into my role vis-a-vis this community, the parable of the electrons also allowed me to see those who cleave so tightly to religion in a different light. Rather than seeing religion as the root of evil, especially at times when the purest form of tradition can border on fundamentalism by funneling hatred through scripture, I saw it all as necessary. When observed with integrity, I was able to see depth and beauty. I also believed that it was okay to have a sense of irony around the purism that I sometimes admired. What I know now is that I was born an electron close to the nucleus, one of thousands helping to keep the tradition strong. When I was 14, part of me saw myself as that kind of charge, or trying very hard to be. But the part of me that had the insight knew I was wrong. I was an excitable electron, far from the center and expanding and experimenting wildly. The pain and the exhilaration of that realization was the beginning of my self-exile, a downward spiral towards a very long and painful redemption.
I grew up I spent my childhood in Borough Park, which was a very Hasidic neighborhood. We didn't watch any movies, we didn't watch any TV, there were no secular newspapers, there was very little English or secular reading material to be had. And later I moved to the village of New Square. I went to yeshiva there, which was even more insular. I don't know how many people know about New Square. It is a very fascinating place, a place I like to say you want to visit it for one day and never go back. But it was a very, it was a good place for me at the time. It gave me a sense of belonging. Borough Park is a place where there are many different Hasidic sects, and New Square was very monolithic, and that was what I was looking for as a 13-year-old boy. And so I became really attached to that community. But over time, I started to feel a certain earlessness in that environment. I got married to someone that I did not really want to marry, not because there was anything particularly wrong with her, but I just hadn't seen anything particularly right with her. Except I had a 5 to 10 minute meeting, and then we went to the Skver Rebbe, and he said, "Mazel tov, you're engaged." And 6 months later, we met in our apartment the night after our wedding. So that was, and that wasn't that bad, because that was what everybody did. And it wasn't until several years after that, when the pressures of living, the pressures of providing for a family sort of took me away from the focus of studying and praying and going to the Rebbe's Tish and having that intense spiritual focus that had been really important to me as a teenager. And I started with little things. We had my wife and I we had one child and then another, and we had a cassette player in our home. And it was one night when my wife was asleep when I realized that the cassette player, which was just a fairly standard Panasonic double-deck thing, I realized it had a functioning radio. Now, it wasn't supposed to have a radio, because the way things were done in our community was, if you got a cassette player, you broke off the antenna, you crazy glued the switch into the tape playing position, and you put masking tape over the channel indicators, and no radio, just a cassette player. But for some reason, I'd never done that with our cassette player, and so it was in the middle of the night, and I decided to, I wanted to listen, I wanted to see what the outside world had to say, and I'd never before turned on a radio in my life, at least not in my adult life. As a child, there were some neighbors who had some radios that occasionally I'd hear snippets of, but it never really registered. But now I was in my 20s, I was probably around 24, and I was really curious what I might hear on the radio if I turned it on. And so I got a pair of earphones and plugged it in, and dragged the chair over to the refrigerator, and began fiddling with the dial, and I listened, and I realized there was some really fascinating information. They were talking about there was a mattress sale in Paramus, and there was a car dealership in Lodi, New Jersey was having a major sale, and there were traffic was backed up on the BQE. It was absolutely mesmerizing, and I just couldn't get enough. So that was one thing, and I started listening regularly every night to the radio, because it was just the mundane aspects of the outside world, the fact that there was a world out there that was so different from the world that I knew, that was all studying and all davening and all everything focused around the Rebbe, which is the case in that really intense Hasidic environment. And so that led me to have an even greater curiosity. And I started going to the public library and reading just whatever I could find, getting my hands on it. So it was really very small acts of rebellion, of curiosity, of trying to sort of see what the outside world has that we didn't have. And that would eventually lead me to more fundamental questions, more profound questions about the things that we believed, about the Hasidic lifestyle, Hasidic principles, and eventually I would start questioning Orthodox dogma, and just in general the traditions that we lived with, and until I came to the point that I read from earlier, where my faith completely fell apart. So that sort of brings you up to there.
And I think I always say that the system really works. If your family life is intact, if your community life intact, if your school life is intact, and if your faith is intact, all that stuff, then it's like I see some of my brothers and sisters, and I have Bli Ayin Hara, Kanayin Hara, poo, plenty of them. I'm the only one who's not Orthodox. I'm the only one out of a lot. And so it really works for a lot of people. And it works, I mean, and we also, whatever. I mean, it's so complicated. The question is so complicated because I haven't actually put my story together. So it's so interesting because you put your story together, and I don't really know my story yet until I tell it. And I know little pieces of the story, and I think I'm interested. I think this has all got me interested to kind of review my life and to start putting the pieces together and say, what happened when one experience after another, these things kind of get strung together. And then over time, you know, I'm not telling my story, but I'm telling you, like, sort of psychologically, I think so many things happen along the way, and then eventually you're definitely not fitting into the system. I mean, the faith thing is a very funny question because I don't think for me it's about faith. I think it's, I always had I think, you know, I was talking about this, like you inherit or I feel like somehow you're born or not born or you lose it, but I feel like I always had some sense of something bigger than myself. And no matter what I went through and all those things that I've gone through, I never lost that. It just didn't mean that bigger thing that was bigger than myself was responsible Torah Sinai and made the world 5,775 years ago. So I didn't necessarily feel like I had to believe those things in order to keep my faith or to keep a certain sense of faith. So it looked different than the faith that I grew up with, but I didn't really, I think, ever lose faith.
For me, it was a very long process. It was first a long process of losing faith, and then it was a long process of trying to figure out how to live without faith in a world that, in an environment, within a society that required that you live a very circumscribed kind of life. And so there was no real option for me to live in a kind of middle ground within that world. And so I made a decision that I was going to leave, but I wasn't quite sure what that meant. I knew that I would no longer be part of this community. I knew that it meant our marriage would fall apart, and I'd been married for almost 15 years. I was convinced that I would be able to maintain an active and present role in my children's lives. I have 5 children, and my wife at the time, her name is, I call her Gitti in the book. It's not her real name, but Gitti, at the time, Gitti and I talked about this, and it was, it seemed to me that we were both on the same page, that we were going to split, and it would be amicable, and we would do one of these really modern things of co-parenting, even though she's going to be living in a really intense Hasidic world, and I am going to go off and become a Shegitz and Apikoros. And that was somewhat naive on my part, because later, as it turned out, she was not quite prepared for that. And I wasn't prepared for where that would go. But just in terms of leaving the Hasidic world and joining the outside world, it was very confusing. And I sort of make this comparison sometimes. You know, you sometimes watch, if you watch courtroom dramas, or if you read a lot of sort of mystery novels, you think you might be able to be a lawyer or be a detective because you watch and read it so much, but the real life is actually different, and you can't become an attorney just by watching courtroom dramas, and you also can't become a non-Hasidic person just by watching a lot of movies about non-Hasidic people. And I mistakenly thought that I did know what it is to be a non-Chassid, because I'd watched many movies by that time. I'd made up for lost time by just having marathon movie watching sessions. And but getting to the outside world, sort of becoming part of the outside world was really difficult. It was very hard to understand. I mean, I'm fairly fluent in English. So it wasn't the language barrier, but there was something that I do call a language barrier. There's a kind of subtext within modern society, within secular society, but modern society broadly, that I didn't understand. There were conversations that I would have. I tried one semester in college. In the end, I decided not to go for a college degree. But that one semester was very confusing. I couldn't make any conversation with the people in my classroom simply because I had no idea what they were talking about. The first time in my life I heard somebody using the word dude or bro in a conversation. I'd seen these words in books, but I'd never heard someone actually use them in a sentence. And it was really strange to me. And so it took some time. After a year, I met other friends. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the organization Footsteps, which is, yes, which is an extremely important organization that I now serve on the board on. But I eventually checked out Footsteps and became part of their community and found many, many, many good friends who were going through a very similar process. Many people who were sort of far ahead of me in their journeys, and as the years would go by, there would be people who were not as far ahead as I was, and so I would teach them, and that became a really important source of just moving on into this new lifestyle.
For both of you, what do you miss about the worlds you left?
I guess I'll start because I have the microphone. What I miss, I mean, there are the obvious things. I don't have a relationship with my children. 5 children, that's been very painful, and so obviously that's, I miss my children. I miss holidays within the Hasidic world. They were very uplifting. There was, I miss going to, taking part in communal celebrations, the Rebbe's Tish. Those things were very important to me. They were uplifting. They were meaningful. They were enriching. And I had to leave all that behind. You can't really live in both worlds. You can't really enjoy the benefits of both worlds in a really wholesome way. I mean, if I go back to New Square, they don't welcome me very warmly. But even if I go someplace else, it's hard to go to a religious, a Hasidic religious ceremony or form of communal observance and feel like you're a real part of it, having left all that and having lost the real sense of meaning that it once had. But I do miss it, and I miss the feeling it once gave me. And I really do miss the feeling of what prayer once meant to me. I don't pray now because I'm not a believing person, and I don't believe in prayer in the way that a religious person believes in prayer. But I remember the feelings that I had when I did believe in it, and those were very important then. And so there's a bit of a nostalgia for that, absolutely. And I miss studying. I miss studying religious texts. I miss studying Hasidic texts. Although I will say I still study. I study religious texts. I have a chavruta every week. We study Masechet Sanhedrin. I don't know how many people here study Talmud regularly, but if you want to check that out, Masechet Sanhedrin is very fascinating, and I still do that even as a non-believing person. But I remember those times when they were really important parts of my life, and I do miss them. Yeah.
Are there things that you miss as well about having left?
I miss some of the same things that Sholem misses. I miss the insularity, the feeling of being kind of cushioned by a sense of like spirit, like everybody, the sense of, on the one hand, all girls singing is the thing that I left so I could sing for everybody. But there was something really beautiful about like Shalosh Shudis, like all the girls singing and doing Pirkei Avos parties. This is very specific things. I think it's so interesting to listen to like the different worlds that happen with the all girls schools and the all boys schools. There are very specific things that all girls do, and we had, one of the things. I mean, yes, I just love being in that kind of sense of empowerment that happens, especially with younger Beis Yaakov girls. Like everyone's like so spirited and so connected, and we all with such kavanah was singing, and like it's like and even though we're singing all together and we're all singing one note, what we're really doing is trying to find our own voice and our own harmony. So I feel like the world that I came to, a lot of us are amazing harmonizers, because everyone had to find some kind of space that wasn't taken from somebody else. And I think that's where my musical training in some ways comes from, is from having to harmonize, having to find my little spot.
But you have, seems like you've found a home for yourself in the religious world, although it's a very different religious world than the one you grew up with. And I know, Shulem, people ask you this question all the time. How was it? How did you make your way to Romemu?
Oh, okay. So after I got kicked out of yeshiva in Israel, I went to Egypt and went to Barnard, became an English major and I started a dance major, and I started writing songs all in English, and I made 2 albums in English, and I decided I was nothing to do with Judaism at all. And then I had a boyfriend for a month, and then a year later he said there's a job at Romamu to be a percussionist, and I had just traveled to Morocco and Turkey, and I picked up the drums, and I went to BJ, and I started playing drums at BJ, and I had to go to shul. I realized I had this weird thing. It's like, if there's a Hashem wants me to be in shul, and he knows that the only way he's going to get me there is he's going to pay me. You know? And so I became a percussionist, and I found myself loving it. I loved it. I loved playing percussion. And in the beginning, I felt really weird because, like, music and shul, that's like not, wait, you know. It's so hard. There are all these hoops you have to jump over, because even though you leave a world, you still come with a lot of your biases, a lot of like you still, this doesn't look right. This, like, it took me forever to have a normal conversation with a boy. Like 15 years, I promise you. Like, it took me that long. Because it just, things are so hard and so different. And then after I was at BJ, I realized that I really enjoyed being in shul, and I went to cantorial school at Aleph, and while I was in cantorial school, I got offered 3 different jobs to be the cantor at Tamid in Tribeca, which I actually live in Tribeca downtown, and then I got offered another job at the Fire Island Synagogue. And that was totally my vision of what to be a cantor would be like on the beach, and I was like, that's the best job ever. And then another best job ever, I got offered to be the musical director at Romamu, and that was a place where people who are spiritual seekers are very much a part. That's the community full of spiritual seekers, people who have had such amazing journeys, whatever journey, not necessarily leaving the Hasidic world, though a lot of people who left Orthodoxy or Hasidism are in that world, people who are Buddhists or shamans, or it attracts a lot of that demographic, people who are really seeking or searching. So that's how I ended up at Romamu.
Sholem, can you find community in these places, or do you feel comfort, or
in places like Romamu or other, say, non-Orthodox communities? I find something in some of these places, but not religion. There's something, I do occasionally go to Friday night services. I've been to Romamu many times. I've been to BJ many times, B'nai Jeshurun many times. And I like it, but the reason I go is not for any kind of religious practice. I go because I want to attach myself to, I want for a sense of peoplehood and for a sense of shared mythology and shared practice and a sense of history and things like that. But I'm not a religious person in any sense. And people often ask me, more broadly what my sense of Jewishness is, and my sense of Jewishness is that I can't get away from my Jewishness even if I try. I can't get away from my identity as an ex-Chassid even if I try. But in terms of finding a world that gives me meaning in the way that religion once did, I think that my meaning comes from the uncertainty. I think that I came from a world of certainty and spent a long time trying to find a world of equal certainty to replace it, and I didn't find it, and I realized that uncertainty is its own value, that the act of seeking and continuing to seek, even though there doesn't seem to be any real hope for finding something concrete in that really concrete sense, I think that search is important, and that search gives me meaning now.
It's so interesting because when you say uncertainty and seeking, and for me, that's religion. You know, it's so funny that you define it as, and for me, the uncertain and the seeking and that is religion for me. I think that is constant striving and yearning and heading into territories that are not like no easy answers, no hard and fast rules. So it's interesting listening to you speak. I'm like, wow, what you're describing is, I feel like, it's similar to me, but I describe that as my kind of, I don't know, the word religion is so interesting because partly it just means, the root is with ligament in there, and it means connection, and I don't really, and religion is such a loaded word anyways, but I find that my place is also very much in those places, but I define myself as more religious, using the same sort of.
I think this is a real critique that I have of the Haredi worldview, and possibly of the Orthodox worldview in general. Although I think the modern Orthodox world would argue that they're not as rigid, but I think the Haredi worldview really does insist that it has a very certain, very certain truth claims, and it makes these claims without equivocation. And I grew up in a world where I was told the words of every single word in the Gemara, every single word in the Talmud, forget about every word in Tanakh, in the Torah, but every single word in the Talmud, every single word in the Zohar, every single word that every Hasidic Rebbe had ever said was absolutely the word of God. And there was no hesitation in making those claims. And so when you grow up in that world, and you're really indoctrinated with that, moving away from that can be really, really traumatic. But I guess some people never take it as seriously.
That's not true. I took it very seriously. No, it's funny. The thing, it's funny. I have one little anecdote of how seriously I took it. Like when I was like a lot happened when I was 7. I took it so seriously that I became super OCD. Like I got to this point where like the Negwasser and the blech had to be a certain thing, and then I was measuring everybody's skirt length. I would walk in the street and I was so OCD, literally OCD. Like I was going crazy. My brain was going. Zzz, I can feel my brain going. Zzz, and then I literally snapped. I knew like I was going to go crazy if I was going to keep doing this, and I literally snapped. Now, for me, though, I respect and I value the seriousness and the devotion that I come from, the orthodoxy that I come from. Personally, I say I really like, since no one knows the answers, we don't know for sure the answers. And there's no certain answers anywhere. I do believe that a lot of how I grew up was a distortion of what religion should be, as opposed to what religion should be, and I can get creamed for that. But there's I feel like. Like if I said one word, again, like I think a lot of us grew up in a world where if we asked like too many questions, you suddenly became an apikaris. I mean, it was a time where our teachers were like, if our teachers who were teaching us Torah were like 17 and a half years old and they barely knew anything, and it was such a funny world that we grew up in. Like even like now there's a lot more consciousness, but we grew up, there was like, it was so crazy and it was such a distortion. And all of us, I think a lot of us who left, it was, you couldn't possibly, there's a lot of us that couldn't possibly believe in that particular certainty and that, like, then you go to school and learn the JEPD and, about the Bible criticism, and that makes total sense.
Sholem, back to your book, do you have a sense of whether people in New Square have read your book, or if you think that your you really point out some of the really serious issues in that community, and if your narrative might actually have some impact on things going on?
I haven't heard much about whether people in New Square are reading it. I heard there are a lot of Satmars reading it. I don't know. I don't know why. The Satmars and the Skverers never liked each other particularly. There's no official feud, but there's like sort of there are undercurrents of tension there, and so I think they got a kick out of the fact that I'm a Shagitz is sort of irrelevant because there's this dirt on Skver. I don't know what impact it's had in that community. I really don't know. I've tried to find out. I've asked a couple people who still have connections, but I don't have any connections to them. But I do know the broader Orthodox world, certainly the modern Orthodox world. Many people have been reading it, but even in the Haredi world, I've been getting a lot of feedback from the Haredi world, and a lot of it, surprisingly, is very positive. Some of it's been, here and there, some angry tweets, some, really ranting emails, some people trying to, some Kiruv rabbis, a Chabad rabbi in Chicago, and some others sort of emailing me, trying to sort of see if they can reel me back in. It hasn't worked so far.
Do either of you have a sense that more and more people seem to be leaving, or is it just that the community is so much larger that the numbers would, naturally be larger?
I think more people are leaving. I mentioned Footsteps before, and Footsteps numbers are definitely growing, and I think more people are leaving because of the internet and because of the existence of Footsteps, which provides a support network. I don't think the numbers are significant when looking at the community as a whole. I think whatever attrition rate there is with the Haredi community, they're able to maintain their numbers. They're reproducing fast enough to make up for whatever they're losing. But I do think there are pretty large numbers leaving. I mean, there haven't been any quantitative studies that would really give you a solid sense of how many have left, but I have a sort of estimate that over the past decade, somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 people have left the Haredi world, I think. And I base that on certain numbers that we have at Footsteps, which I'm now a board member, and some other networks that we have of ex-Haredim. But it's hard to really know, but I think those numbers are fairly significant when looked at on by its own.
I think it's so interesting because I think I left quite a bit before you, and I think there were so many people who left before that just kind of either just struggled and struggled and struggled. There was no community of people trying to, no support, no network. So I think there's the years before you left, I just met someone on Fire Island just on my bike, and she's like, "Hi, my name is Nechama." And she's like, I left Orthodox, she just randomly told me her story. And I think there's just so many people. And I just did, I don't know, everywhere I go, I feel like I'm an ex-Orthodox magnet, Like I go places, and every time, like I go anywhere, there's just someone, I also went to Basya Schechter. I also went to Campanos. I have that, people like are exhausted from when they're with me, they're like, again? But there are also people from much older generations that I really see a lot of people that before we even have a chance to calculate, but we never had a chance to mark those exits.
There was just this really tragic story of the young woman who left, who committed suicide, which seems to indicate that there just aren't enough resources to really help people in that situation. Would you agree that?
I think it's true. People who leave struggle for a long time, especially if you leave from the really insular Hasidic world. I'm not so sure. If you leave the yeshivish world, you probably have a better facility with the English language. You might have a high school diploma and you can get into college. Maybe not. But those who leave the really insular Hasidic world, Skver, Satmar, Belz, places like that, you might struggle just with finding housing, finding food, having money to buy clothes and things like that. And yes, that is a real struggle. And I know a lot of people who go through very serious periods of very dark periods, I would say. And that's a very common narrative within people who leave, especially the more insular parts, and especially when there is family shunning. I think that is one of the key sort of I would say triggers or the key stressors for people who leave. If your family, especially if your parents and siblings have disowned you, then that creates a kind of emotional crisis that people really have a hard time getting over, and I've seen that in so many cases. And this is one thing, I've been fortunate that my father died when I was 14, so he's not around anymore, but I am fortunate that my siblings have accepted me. I wouldn't say they're supportive, with what I do. They don't quite like the fact that I don't keep Shabbos and kosher, but they still love me. And my mother certainly supported me because she's actually sitting right here, and I am incredibly grateful for that. But not everyone has that, and when that happens, that can really throw people into an incredibly dark place. Yeah.
I think in some cases it has to do with the physical resources, losing those and being shunned also. But I just know a lot of people from the yeshivish world. I'm just going to speak from the other side that also had there's a lot of trauma that people leaving this one world. I think it's maybe, I think there's always like, oh, the Hasidic world is much, much worse. This whole is much, much worse if you come from Satmar or Babiv or Skver. And it's just not so bad if you grew up, if you grew up Beis Yaakov. It's just like it's much easier for you. But I think in some ways there's some things that are worse about the yeshivish world. And I actually, when Leah Vincent wrote her amazing memoir called Cut Me Loose, has anybody, you should, yeah. Amazing. I was like, one for the yeshivish. There's a different level, there's a different kind of trauma that happens there, because I think there's like a kind of seriousness. Like, I felt like some of my friends who are Hasidish in Borough Park, like their fathers were so warm and cozy with them. So there was just there was joy and coziness and warmth. And my father never even touched me. Like, it was like nothing, it was like, couldn't hug me for like a second, because there was one Gemara about something. I don't know what the Gemara was, but there was some Gemara that really like prevented, and so there was like there's so much crazy trauma that you can have from growing up in these different places. And that when you leave, you also can have, these experiences of like your whole world, your whole worldview. It's a similar worldview. It's a little different. We don't wear our skirts as long to the floor, and we don't. But there's like a similar trauma. And I know for myself, and I know for the people that I grew up with who also left, we were like really flailing. I mean, most of us were flailing so hard. Like, I'm just gonna cry. It was. I totally relate to Kvegi's story, not necessarily from the Hasidic point of view, from that place of carrying trauma and having nowhere to put it, and having no tools to work it through. And it takes a very long time. I think so many of them, like they're 25, 26, they don't realize that if you go through another 5 or 10 years of that torture, you kind of can get to someplace else. But it sometimes takes 10 to 15 years of torture. Really that long. Of like really like being under your blanket for like days, weeks, months, like can't get out, So so I'm just, I'm reflecting a different side.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really important to bring up, because I think the people who leave the really insular communities and barely even speak English and have the more obvious handicaps with moving into the outside world, it lends itself more easily to a kind of dramatic narrative in a way that maybe people who leave a world where they do speak English and sort of maybe they've had some access, they're somewhat conversant with the outside culture, at least relative to people who come from New Square. And I think there is a kind of trauma that sometimes is not acknowledged. And so I want to say two things about, since we're speaking about Leah Vincent, who's not here tonight, but I agree, she wrote a fantastic book, Cut Me Loose, and I'm proud to have worked with her on it when it came out. And Leah actually, I don't want to speak for her, but I remember conversations that she and I had about defining the yeshivish world, because most people don't know what the yeshivish world is. People know there are the ultra-Orthodox, and people know there are Hasidim. But the yeshivish world is somewhat less known because they don't stand out as much. People see people from the yeshivish world and they just assume they're Hasidic. And that's the one adjective that you know, but the yeshivish world is a very different kind of world. So I think Leah actually defined the yeshivish world and gave a narrative that is very specific to the yeshivish world, and I think she did something really important with that. Second thing I want to say, and this is also about Leah. Leah wrote an incredibly moving article called "The Death Prophecy of the Post-Orthodox Experience," something like that, where she spoke of growing up in an environment where you're told that if you leave, you will be a prostitute, you will be homeless, you will be lonely and have no one, and you will die sick and alone. And that is something that was a message that she really got in her world. In the Hasidic world, maybe you don't get those kinds of messages because it seems like you don't even have to warn people not to leave. I'm not sure, but it does seem like in the yeshivish world, it seems like people do get that kind of message, and it gets so internalized that leaving can be such an intense trauma because you have these prophecies of failure, and it's so hard to get rid of those recordings in your head. You will fail, you won't make it, you won't make it. And just like you said, you have to sort of get past those 5, 10, 15 years. And Leah, along with some other friends of mine, Ari Mandel and Sam Katz, started a project called It Gets Besser. Because people really do need to know that you need to push through. The first 5 years are really difficult. The first 10 years also, but it really does get better. And I can say that, and I'm assuming Basya can say that as well. And knowing Leah has said that. So, yeah, I think that's a
So you're both actually great role models. I have lots more questions, but I know that many of you have questions. So the question is about gender differences in leaving.
I think it's interesting. A lot of women specifically have issues with the fact that Orthodox Judaism is very patriarchal, and we're not allowed to have a lot of the roles. We can't be the rabbi, and we can't go into the men's section. And for me, actually, the first time that I was no longer allowed to go into the men's section, I lost a lot of interest in going to shul altogether. And then I make a joke. I said, then I became very good at cutting lettuce. Which a lot of you might not understand, but then like a lot of girls and women in the Orthodox world, you spend a lot of time cutting lettuce before the men come home from shul. But I think I actually didn't have that particular issue. I think the issue itself was the voice, finding my voice and realizing that if I wanted to sing, if I wanted to be artistic, if I wanted to express myself the way I wanted to express myself, I was always a little too much. Like, if I was the head of dance and production in Basya Schechter. I mean, I think, that's like a thing. And I was a dancer at Campanos. But when I danced, people would say, Basya, you're dancing too pressed. And like, I would just move a little bit too much. So for me as a woman, I recognized that I couldn't express emotionally and physically and spiritually. Actually, I couldn't be me and express myself in the world that I was from. So for me, the gender thing was more about there was no way to be fully myself in the world that I grew up in.
One thing we do see is that there are more men than women who leave, I think. Certainly in Footsteps, the numbers are greater with men than women. And there are various theories about it. In part, it probably has to do with the fact that, especially if you're married, women have a harder time getting out of a situation if they're married. They're a lot more dependent on the societal and familiar structures within the community. With single people, I'm not sure there's that much of a difference in the numbers. But one of the interesting things is we've seen a lot more writing by women than by men. And I've been asked that question, why I think that is, and I think men who come from that world, from the Haredi world, are less inclined to sort of think of their journeys in terms of their experiences, and more inclined to think of the intellectual. I shouldn't say this. They're more inclined to be somewhat abstract, and they'll sort of shy away from the narrative aspects and the sort of focus on personal experience. And that's something that I did do with my book, because I felt it was really important to narrate the particular experience of, I mean, there is a male experience within certainly the Hasidic world. I don't know if the yeshivish world, how similar it is, but there's a very particular male experience that I think doesn't get talked about, doesn't get highlighted. The fact that boys go through, the kind of education that boys have within the Hasidic world is is an absolute travesty. Boys from, there's absolutely no general studies education after age 12, even before I have 2 sons, they're 13 and 15, who cannot speak, read, or write English. They were both born and raised in this country. And they just have absolutely no. They were taught the alphabet and basic arithmetic, like addition and subtraction, and that's it. And they're supposed to, and they spend morning to night studying Talmud mostly, and many of them have no aptitude for it, no interest in it. There is lots and lots of corporal punishment in Hasidic schools for boys. In girls' schools, I don't think it's nearly as common for girls to be hit, actually like slapped and beaten. Boys have that routinely. I hear that it's getting a little bit better, but it still goes on. And I remember as a child, these things are still vivid for me. The kind of sadism that rebbes, that Hasidic teachers in elementary school, the kind of things that kids would get beaten for mercilessly. You come out of that pretty traumatized, and I think that's an experience that people aren't so aware of, and that affects you for life. And it doesn't affect only you, it affects the way you behave to your spouse and the way you behave to your own children. And if you then become a teacher or a rebbe and a cheder, it affects how you're going to relate to children. And the pressures of providing for large families when birth control is not an option. We generally think of reproductive choice as a women's issue, which obviously it is, but men have a stake in that as well. When I wanted my wife and I to use birth control, she was the one who refused because growing up and living in a Hasidic environment, women are really attached to the idea of, they're raised with the idea that being a mother is one of their most important roles. And she told me I'd feel naked if I'm, not either pushing a stroller or pregnant, and for good reason, because she would get questions. Our youngest eventually we did start using birth control, and our youngest was 5 years old, and people would, her family would ask her uncomfortable questions about why, why our youngest was 5 and what happened and things like that. People really feel the pressure to just keep having children, but this affects men too, because men have to provide for them. The Hasidic world, the gender roles are really, really rigid, and so the women are going to stay home. The men are going to have to go out with no marketable skills and really meager secular education and figure out how to earn money. They're not taught anything about how to earn. Some people will be successful as entrepreneurs, but other than that, there aren't that many options. And I think that's an important aspect of the male experience to realize.
So thank you both. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.